Have you ever gotten angry at something or someone and you sat down and wrote an email and just sort of channeled all your rage into that email, or maybe you fired off a text at somebody, and then after a while, maybe a week or so, you regretted it because you realized what you did really hurt some people? And then comes the hard part of trying to make amends and reconcile and smooth things over. Well, that's Second Corinthians. 2 Corinthians was written after Paul wrote what he called the tearful letter. And the tearful letter really upset the Corinthians. And so 2 Corinthians is a follow-up and an attempt to reconcile and mend the hurt that Paul did with the earlier letter. After Paul wrote 1 Corinthians while he was in Ephesus, he told the congregation that he was going to head off to Macedonia. But then, for whatever reason, he changed his mind and surprised the Corinthians with a visit. He mentions this in chapter 1, beginning in verse 15. And something happened during that visit. If you take all the clues that are there in this letter, essentially, it appears that Paul confronted some of the members in the church over their sins, and then some other members did something to intentionally hurt Paul. Paul left in a huff, and this was the anger that was poured into then this tearful letter that he then wrote the Corinthians fairly soon after this visit. And it caused them a lot of pain. And so after a while, obviously, Paul thought better of it and decided to do something about it. So that brings up the critical issue about 2 Corinthians, which is trying to figure out how this plays in all of the letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. It appears, if you've been counting, that this is the fourth letter, because remember we had the lost letter that's mentioned in 1 Corinthians, and then we have 1 Corinthians, and then we have Paul leaving in a huff, writing a tearful letter, and so 2 Corinthians then pretty much becomes the fourth letter. The issue, though, is that when you read 2 Corinthians, it's very choppy. So what does that tell us? Well, it's not Paul's best writing. In fact, out of all the letters that we know Paul wrote, this is probably the least polished. Not probably, it is the least polished of them all. So either Paul was in a rush and sat down on several occasions and sort of picked up where he left off and then went off on a tangent or whatever. So in other words, maybe he was writing this on the run and that plays into the choppiness, or it might be that 2 Corinthians is actually a mashup of several letters that Paul wrote, and some scholars even think that the tearful letter was incorporated in 2 Corinthians and can be found in chapters 10 through 13. Regardless, it's obvious that Paul wrote several letters to the Corinthians, and more than likely 2 Corinthians represents in some way, shape, or form a fourth letter that he wrote to them. And all of these letters, I should mention, were written fairly quickly after one another. One of the themes that we find then in 2 Corinthians is a bit of a diatribe against a group of people, or at least a small couple of people, he refers to as the super apostles. These super apostles were probably there at that surprise visit that Paul made, and it may certainly have contributed to the anger that rose up in Paul. Tough to tell who they are because we're reading this through the eyes of one man and his, let's just say, overreaction to them. They were probably Hebrew Christians, And a part of what made Paul angry is that they claimed to have had a higher authority than Paul in the Jesus movement. And in fact, they were quite critical of Paul himself. In particular, they attacked Paul as being rather plain. You can read a lot into this. Maybe Paul wasn't the best looking person. Maybe Paul wasn't very charismatic when he spoke. He may have been a bit monotone. There's an interesting story in the book of Acts of him preaching one evening, and a guy actually fell asleep and fell out of a window. So, who knows what this was all about. But in a world where oratory and rhetoric was like sports today, following that allusion or that illustration, it was like saying Paul only had an 85-mile-an-hour fastball and really shouldn't be playing in the major leagues. So with that being said, Paul leaves Corinth in a bit of a huff. And of course, he has the critiques of these super apostles rolling around in his head. And a big part of what we find in 2 Corinthians is Paul defending himself against these super apostles and then going on the attack against them. And he wasn't always very mature about it. In fact, in chapter 11, beginning in verse 13, he's going to call these super apostles Satan in disguise. That was a little bit uncalled for. Nonetheless, you can tell that there's a lot of, let's just say, bad blood between super apostles and Paul. Now, it doesn't seem to be that there was any heresy that these super apostles were teaching. I think Paul certainly would have mentioned them in his attacks against them, and he doesn't. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong that they're actually teaching. This appears to be more of a fight over who was more important in the church, Paul or the super apostles. And yeah, this does kind of sound like something that would happen on a middle school playground. And I think if anything, it illustrates the humanity of Paul, and we see that in full form in this letter. So with this in mind, one of the things that Paul will do in his defense is outline what a true apostle is. And among them, in chapter 15, verse 8, Paul is going to say that a real apostle, a true apostle, is one who has witnessed the risen Lord. And as you may recall in his biography in Galatians and elsewhere, Paul mentions that the risen Lord appeared to him in Arabia. And there may even have been more than one appearance of the risen Lord to Jesus. And he says in chapter 15 that Paul may have been the last person that the risen Lord appeared to. The implication of this being that he appeared to me last, he didn't appear to anybody else, and he certainly didn't appear to you guys, you super apostles. Another thing that he claims to be a sign of a true apostle is an authentication by being able to perform signs and wonders. This was a euphemism for miracles, and Paul mentions in chapter 12, verse 12, that Paul performed many of these miracles in the midst of the Corinthians. And of course, the implication being, did the super apostles perform any miracles in front of you guys? A third defense is Paul says that a true apostle is one who plants churches. And Paul reminds the Corinthians that he is their spiritual father. He does this in chapter 6, verse 13, and again in chapter 12, verse 14. The implication of this being that these Corinthians owed a spiritual allegiance and some loyalty to Paul because he is the one who founded their church. He spent 18 months there, as you may recall. They were his disciples, and so there was some authority that Paul, I think, was trying to claim here as well. And then I think in a subtle way, we see this in chapter 10, verse 16, I think, that if the super apostles really want to be apostles, they need to go off and plant their own churches. And if they want to claim authority over those churches, then fine, but leave my church alone. He even makes fun in chapter 3, verse 1 of those who claim their authority and authenticity from letters of recommendation. So, again, Paul being Paul here is trying to defend his apostleship and authority against these super apostles. Now, we need to talk then a little bit about the ambiguity of this word apostle. The word literally means sent out ones, and it was oftentimes used in the New Testament merely to refer to missionaries who were doing missionary work. Now, where this gets confusing is we typically today refer to the apostles as the 12 who Jesus chose, and then of course we typically include Paul in those 12 to actually make it 13. But whether or not that was the case back in this era when Paul was writing isn't all that clear yet. We certainly have this idea of the tradition of the apostles, and we certainly have this idea of the 12 and Paul being among sort of this super group of leaders in the early part of the Jesus movement. But that is an idea that comes about later. We are still sort of in the midst of all of this as it's being hashed out at this point. So it's important for us to understand that that word apostle is used in a lot of different ways. And even Paul is going to, I think, use it in different ways. For example, in Romans chapter 6, verse 7, he is going to refer to a couple of people, perhaps a couple, Andronicus and Junia, as prominent among the apostles. Truth of the matter is, these two individuals, I don't think would have fit Paul's definition of an apostle that he outlines here, and yet he calls them apostles. So all that is to say, the word apostle, don't get too caught up in that word. It wasn't, the definition of it wasn't really set in stone just quite yet. Another thing that we find in 2 Corinthians is Paul talking about boasting. Now, a part of this is going to come from, I think, Paul feeling that he needed to defend himself and explain why he does have authority and has more authority than these so-called super apostles. He reminds the Corinthians in chapter 12 that he received his visions from Christ. And then he says something interesting. He said, I know of someone who is caught up to the third heaven. Now, what was he talking about here? Well, it's a literary device that Paul was actually using here. He's referring to himself. He is claiming here that he had a vision and that he was caught up in third heaven. Now, what is this whole third heaven thing? Well, there was this idea in Judaism at this time that one could have such a strong vision that he is caught up in heaven. Even Paul seems to mention that he couldn't tell if this was just a vision or if this was a bodily experience. And third heaven was this place where God spoke to people directly. So in a sense, what you have here is Paul kind of bragging about this vision that he had, this out-of-body experience that he had, where God took him up to heaven, to third heaven, and he received this deep wisdom from Christ. And if you read the chapter in chapter 12, you can see Paul doing this in a roundabout way. Another thing that Paul will bring up to defend his apostleship and boast about a little bit is something he describes as a thorn in the flesh. And you see it pictured here on the slide. And in this, he says that a messenger from Satan was sent to torment him. And this is, I think, a subtle connection to the temptations of Christ out in the desert. when Satan appeared to Christ and tormented him. I think Paul is sort of making that connection between himself and Christ in this instance. Now, it begs the question, what is he talking about here? What is this thorn in the flesh? And as you can imagine, there is a lot of speculation about it. Even we read one commentator say that maybe this thorn in the flesh was an ex-wife of Paul's. I doubt seriously that there's any validity to that at all. But that just, I think, illustrates some of the wild speculation about this. Was this a physical malady? Was it an emotional malady? Who knows? The bottom line here, though, is that Paul uses this thorn in the flesh to brag or boast a little bit about himself. He saw it as a means of God deeming him worthy enough, important enough, that this messenger of Satan was allowed to torment him. And then in verse 8 he proclaims, "But power is made perfect in weakness." So what he's actually doing here in chapter 12, verse 8, is flipping things around. He points to these super apostles who are pointing out how great they were in comparison to how weak, plain Paul was. But Paul is saying weakness is actually a sign from God that God has chosen that person, because God chooses to work through the weak, not through the charismatic, not through the good-looking, not through the polished. So can you see what Paul's doing here? He's flipping this thing around. So the fact that I'm weak, the fact that I'm not polished, the fact that I am plain actually is a sign that I am from God and you guys are not. He says in verse 10, quote, "Therefore I am content with weakness, insults, hardship, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." Take that, you super apostles. And then Paul goes on to point out immaturity among the super apostles. So again, this is going back to that idea that an implication of Paul recognizing his weakness is that he's mature, because a mature person would recognize their weakness. The fact that the super apostles think that they're all that great and super is an indication of their immaturity. A final aspect of 2 Corinthians that I want to address, a final theme, is a collection that Paul is trying to solicit money for. He's going to spend a lot of time on this collection. He spoke about it in 1 Corinthians. He's bringing it up again here in 2 Corinthians, and it appears elsewhere in Paul's letters. What was this Jerusalem collection that he's talking about? Well, as you can imagine, there's a lively discussion among scholars about it. I think it's connected to a statement that we find in Paul's letter to the Galatians, where at the Jerusalem council mentioned in Acts chapter 15, Paul says, "I didn't give him anything, but they told me to remember the poor, and I'm eager to remember the poor." Maybe this Jerusalem collection was Paul's way of proving his eagerness for the poor. In Acts chapter 11, beginning in verse 27, the text describes a prophet by the name of Agabus, who came to Jerusalem and predicted a widespread famine. The church responded to this prediction by starting a fund to take care of the believers who lived in Judea who might be affected by this famine when it comes. So again, this was a prediction. And in this text, the disciples in Jerusalem determined that other congregations throughout the Roman Empire should contribute to this fund and give according to their abilities. The text says, quote, "This they did, sending it to the elders by Barnabas and Saul," end quote. So they include then Paul in this collection. They wanted to send Paul out to raise some money for when this famine might come. And so it appears that I think this Jerusalem collection is connected to the statement in Acts chapter 11 and in Galatians as well. Now, I think have to, as with all texts in the New Testament, try to read between the lines and see perhaps what else may be at work here, though not clearly stated. And remember, Paul he considers himself to be an apostle to the Gentiles, and he's very well aware of the tension that existed between the Gentile Christians and the Hebrew Christians. And he's probably very much aware of the tension that existed between himself and the apostles. Remember the confrontation that took place that he mentions in Galatians, his letter to the Galatians, between himself and Peter. Well, it could be that that another motivation in all of this is to use this collection to smooth things over a little bit between himself and the apostles, and to smooth things over between himself and the Gentiles. So there are a lot of rationales here that I think we find that might be underlying all of this. Also, in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 16, and in 2 Corinthians 8 through 9 then, we find Paul encouraging the Corinthians to contribute to this offering. And Paul's going to offer a lot of reasons why this is a good idea. Giving is a privilege and a responsibility. He says this in chapter 8, verses 13 and 14 of 2 Corinthians. And it's designed to ensure that fellow believers who have needs have those needs met by others who have an abundance. And so this becomes one of the rationales that he presents for giving. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1, he also describes that this offering is an opportunity to demonstrate unity among the Gentiles and the Jews. In other words, Paul found it very, very important that despite your heritage, that we are all one body in Christ, that we are all unified in Christ. And this offering was a tangible way for Gentiles to show their unity with their Hebrew brethren. He also, in chapter 8, beginning in verse 7, insists that this offering must be voluntary, that it must be done according to one's means. So if you couldn't give a lot, fine. You don't have to, but if you are wealthy, then I think the expectation that the wealthier people gave more and were generous. And so there's an encouragement, I think, overall for generosity in this. And a part of our motivation for being generous is the fact that Jesus himself was generous. Jesus gave himself for us. And so us giving money is actually a small thing in comparison to the kind of generosity that Jesus offered. Jesus became poor on our behalf. And so we should follow his role model. And then a final rationale I think that Paul presents here in his letters is he pulls out the competition card. He says, those Macedonians, remember the Macedonians, they went through some pretty hard times, and yet, guys, they gave a sizable gift to this Jerusalem offering. You don't want to be embarrassed by the Macedonians, do you? He mentions this in chapter 9, verse 1. And so he pulls out the competition card as well in trying to egg on the Corinthians to give generously to this fund. A last thing that I would mention then about the collection is reputation. The early Christians, all throughout the empire, developed a reputation for being very generous. They developed a reputation for being the place that you went to if you found yourself in hard times, because you could count on the Christians to take you in, to feed you, to clothe you, and to help you get back up on your feet again. It's one of the reasons why Christianity exploded throughout the empire, this reputation. When I think about this, though, it sort of grieves me a little bit because um, I keep reading articles and polls and studies that have been conducted about Christians here in our culture. And I can promise you that at the top of the list is not that we are people who are loving and caring and generous, that we are the kind of people that you can go to if you find yourself going through hard times. Unfortunately, Christians in our society today have more of a reputation of being hateful, of being judgmental, of being really the last people that you would want to go to if you found yourself in hard times, because they're going to look down at you. My question is, what's happened? What's happened to us today that we almost have the exact opposite reputation of the early Christians at the beginning of the Jesus movement? I think a part of the things, one of the things that I think that Paul's letter to the Corinthians here causes us to sort of pause and reflect about is what's happened to our reputation. How can we get back that reputation of being compassionate and generous and a grace-filled people? I think once we are able to do that, we might be able to turn things around in the church. But we have a long way to go before we get there.